Kia ora, and welcome to this month's Memia podcast discussion with New Zealanders doing amazing work shaping the future. My name is Ben Reid. I write the twice weekly Memia newsletter covering emerging tech, new ideas, and thinking about the future. You can subscribe for free at hbsmemia.substack.com. This week, I'm delighted to welcome Matt Boyd, Director of New Zealand-based Adapt Research, and a regular correspondent of mine pulling together the Memia newsletters. Matt is originally medically trained, but completed his PhD in philosophy, and he's since built a career as an independent researcher in the academic, public and private sectors. And for the last 5 years, Matt's research is attempting to understand and help reduce the largest threats to humanity, so looking at global, catastrophic and existential risks. Actually, Matt and I have worked together on a few AI research projects ourselves, notably the AI Forum's series of reports on national AI policy and AI and health back in 2019. He's a regular commenter on the Memia newsletter, and I really value his insights on some of the biggest questions facing humanity today. So, Matt, great to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. It's great to be here, and I must say I really appreciate your work.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm on Wednesday. I'm over hump week today because it's Wednesday and the newsletter's gone out this morning, which is brilliant. Okay, let's just we can have a pretty open and flowing conversation here, because I think there's plenty of areas we can delve into, and I think before we know it, the time will be up. But maybe let's just start with your current work that you're focusing on. So catastrophic risks and existential risk for humanity as a whole. So how does a researcher, I know you've got a background in sort of health and medicine, how have you gravitated towards this as your chosen field of research?
Yeah, so as you say, originally I did study medicine, and I guess I was always a bit more interested in the bigger questions, if you like, and to the degree that I after reading a book by Richard Dawkins on the philosophy of biology, I decided to go and do a master's and PhD in philosophy, right. and then during that process, I started getting very interested in evolution and human social and cultural evolution over long periods of time. So following the PhD, I got a job as a research fellow, and it was in the Auckland University School of Medicine, obviously on the strength of my medical training rather than necessarily my philosophy training. But the project there was quite interesting. So we were trying to improve the safety of teamwork in that critical care setting, and that was trying to reduce harm to sort of one person at a time, if you like. And subsequent to that role, I did some more work in sort of what you might consider more public health area, in things like bowel cancer screening or some work for the National Health Committee, and I guess this is looking at helping to reduce harm to populations, like the New Zealand population. And I sort of started considering, well, how much harm is it possible to reduce, and what's the scale of, how big does the problem get? And I guess that naturally led me to collaborating on some work about pandemics, which is obviously right. Potential harm to a global population. And then, conceptually thinking beyond that, you're thinking, well, there's a whole lot of future generations as well. It's not just the people alive today. And there's potential harm to future generations as well. And so, basically the greatest triggers of the greatest harms are these things which we might call existential risks, which is an event or some process that basically ends humanity, in which case it would harm not just everybody alive now, but would also, prevent the possibility of future well-being and future generations existing.
So, I mean, maybe we'll just jump straight into those existential risks right now. So what are the top 10 or top 5 existential risks facing humanity in 2022? Because there's a lot going on right now.
Yeah, right? That's right. Look, there's a set of risks that are considered to be potentially existential, and I guess when you're talking about which are the greatest, I guess there's considerations of the probability of these risks occurring, and then the magnitude of the impact or the likelihood that they might actually wipe out everyone. And and these risks they'll have some sort of origin, and they'll scale up around the world, and then eventually they could potentially finish everyone off. So if you look just at the probability that that these things occur, probably the most likely ones this century. Anyway, I'll sort of cite from Toby Ord's work in the book The Precipice, which I'm not saying I necessarily agree with all his probabilities here, but it's a good guide. It's a widely read book, and he thinks that this century or in the next 100 years, the risk that unaligned artificial intelligence run amok in some way might end humanity is potentially as high as 10%. But it's obviously not 10% in the next year. We're just not there yet. So if we're looking in the next year, the highest probability existential threats are probably things like an extreme pandemic, potentially one that's been bioengineered for maximum impact, or some combination of pandemics, a multi-pandemic. Yep. Then another risk would be nuclear war, which is widely considered to potentially or have the potential to cause a nuclear winter. And I know you had Lyndon Burford on.
Yeah, I choose some cheery topics for these podcasts, right? I know it's a really good conversation with Lyndon, and I think the timing of that was amazing because we did that just towards the end of last year, and then you look at what's happening with Russia and Ukraine right now, and very much, a lot of what he was talking about is just playing out now in terms of there's this escalation and, these attempts to sort of contain it within a conventional war within Ukraine's borders, but could just go any which way still, right?
Absolutely. And then just to sort of, I guess, complete the list of the 3 or 4 top risks, a supervolcanic eruption is definitely a possibility, and probably has very similar impacts to a nuclear war, with the impact on climate. And
what, just run through. So what would happen? So
yeah.
And I remember speaking to Lyndon, and I think you've mentioned this as well, that a small regional nuclear conflict between, say, India and Pakistan would basically drive a nuclear winter around the world. Well, what is it radiation poisoning, or is climate impact, or what?
So that's the sort of the thinking, and all this is highly uncertain because obviously it's very difficult to conduct experiments and whatnot in this area. So it's largely based on modelling work, but integrated modelling of climate and ocean and even crop modelling has shown that it depends very much on how many weapons are detonated and what the target is, whether it's cities, which would have a lot of combustible material, or whether it's military targets in more remote areas. But potentially all the soot from this the fires would rise into the stratosphere. Again, that's also controversial, just the dynamics of firestorms and so forth. But the models suggest that the soot would rise into the stratosphere and spread around the world, thereby basically cooling the planet,
blocking out the sun.
Blocking out the sun, and destroying ozone, and reducing precipitation, and all sorts of climate and ecological effects. But the net outcome of that is that the yield from global agriculture would drop substantially, even as you alluded to in a quote small nuclear war, perhaps between India and Pakistan or something like that. You might see a 1.8 degree mean global temperature drop. And obviously the opposite direction to what we're talking about.
With climate change, right? Yeah.
So and the thinking is that in New Zealand we could see, in the worst case scenario, potentially up to 58% reduction in crop yield.
Here in Aotearoa.
Yeah, and compare that to perhaps continental Europe, where the worst of the frost and ice and whatnot might strike, in places like Ukraine and China and the United States, where there's obviously a lot of grains grown, could see 90 to 100% reduction in crop yield.
I mean, I was going to ask you this question at the end, but we'll go back into the rest. But how do you study this stuff and then maintain a positive mindset?
Yeah, look, that's a good question. I guess I'm inherently optimistic, and if you look at the trajectory of humanity over the last couple of 100 years, we've made all sorts of wonderful gains in things like life expectancy, infant mortality, rights and whatnot. And people like Steven Pinker have tracked this in some of their work. And look, if things go well, there's no reason to think that that sort of trajectory wouldn't continue into the future. And so I guess the optimist in me says, well, let's make sure that things go well then, and the future can be even better.
Yeah, I mean, I look at those stats as well. That optimistic view on, we've never had it so lucky, never had, life so good. But it feels that it doesn't really account for a lot of the externalities. I mean, when you look at, basically the oceans are dying off. We've got, climate change, which will, lead to quite likely, ecological collapse in all around the world. And so, it feels those are pretty major support systems. And so it may be that we've been increasing life expectancy and infant mortality and so on, but in a unbalanced, way. We're trying to develop political systems and accounting systems to, we maybe talk about well-being measures and measuring climate change, measuring carbon emissions. How do we stop ecological collapse?
Yeah, so you raise a good point, and the if you look at those lists of the existential risks, they definitely include the ecological impacts of climate change and biodiversity degradation and potentially unknown impacts on the environment that that we're not particularly aware of yet. And so I guess I include within that set of risks, which if we can solve them all, then the future would be, could be really good. I include these problems. And so some of the issues that we need to, or some of the risks, we need to prevent are these risks of ecological collapse. I think that's along with, preventing nuclear war and along with preventing the next pandemic, preventing those cascading effects through our ecosystems is
cascading is definitely, you feel like that there's potentially a build-up of all of these things that are going to, everyone talks about the meta crisis now. It's been, my rabbit hole of choice in the last couple of months is reading up around that, and there's crises all over the place, all culminating at once. And so very interesting time to be alive.
and potentially, we might see impact from these things quite suddenly, because if you look to ecological resilience theory, a resilient system in ecological terms is really one that can withstand shock and continue to function. But then you reach these tipping points where a system might suddenly and potentially irreversibly flip into a new state. We see this with algal blooms and things like this. But the planetary system, climate systems, and so forth, basically operate on the same principles.
Could the ecology of the world adjust?
Yeah, look, that's probably not my area of expertise, but I think the potential is there. I mean, if you look at the grandest time spans, I guess, across history, we've clearly seen that species have ranged very far north, when times were warmer, and then have been sort of compressed into more equatorial regions when ice ages struck and so forth. And so there's clearly an adaptive capacity there for both ecological systems and human systems. I guess it hinges on the pace of the change, and if the pace of the degradation is faster than the pace of shifting key systems and adaptation and so forth, then that mismatch could cause trouble.
Yeah, and if you go back in the sort of fossil record, and I think I wrote about it once, and I can't remember, it's the Eocene period, I think, but there was basically a massive temperature spike of around 2 to 3 degrees Celsius with increased, as I understand, carbon dioxide. I'll put this in the podcast notes. And then a large extinction event that followed that straight away. And so it's a real anomaly in the fossil record, I think. And so there are some scientists who say that what's happening right now with the Anthropocene changes is very indicative of what happened back then.
It's certainly the case that the majority, it seems, of the historical mass extinctions were related to these kinds of events, probably driven by volcanism, and in one case probably tipped over the edge by the asteroid impact of Chicxulub. You know, which we can add to that list of existential risks. Asteroid impact, the return period, if you like, of you know, the sort of world-killing asteroids is very long. You know, so in the order of millions of years. So, you know, I wouldn't say that we should just ignore the problem, because I guess if you know, at some point you have to do something, or eventually it's going to get you. But you know, we probably shouldn't be putting, you know, all our resources into you know, asteroid deflection or whatever at the moment. Just have some people working on it.
Yeah, and you've got Elon Musk and his ilk working on interplanetary species, which probably is going to happen sooner in the future than a lot of people think.
But you know, look, I like to see. I mean, I like to look at this sort of exploration as you know, a bit analogous to, you know, when you think of you know, Viking populations back in the day when they were first sort of setting sail for, you know, for Greenland or whatever, and yeah, it was, you know, rudimentary and it was small and so forth, but you know, bit by bit it led to you know, fascinating exploration around the world, and you know, these Mars missions, you know, as another arrow in the quiver of protection against existential risk. I think you know, they're useful in that regard. Maybe not useful in the immediate future, but at some point, if humanity wants to survive, we will have to move elsewhere, because eventually the sun will, you know, engulf the earth basically and boil the oceans off. So
yeah, a few hundred million years to go.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I'm still, you know, working my way through Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy. So, you know, Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars, which I don't know if you've read that, but it's sort of, you know, just this historical account. You know, it's quite a gripping, you know, piece of fiction, but it's this historical account, very detailed on, you know, the technology and the progression of building a civilization, you know, moving people there first and then building a civilization over time, and the politics around that, and absolutely fascinating set of books to read. Talk me through, because you've basically been writing some papers recently on risks, but also, you know, ways that you know, society and government in particular can, you know, work to respond and to react to these. So just talk me through some of that thinking that you've been doing, and maybe bring it into a New Zealand Aotearoa context. Yeah, sure.
So you know, when I say we, it's often I collaborate with the public health physician Nick Wilson, and a few others here and there as well. But he's probably my most common co-author. And over the last 5 years or so, we have written a set of papers looking at two broad areas, I guess. One is specific risks and what might be done specifically for those risks. And then another sort of set of papers looking at risk more generally as a suite, and what might be done, you know, in the analysis and mitigation of risk as a category rather than particular risks. And so I guess it began with thinking around pandemics, and not even necessarily pandemics as existential risks, because, you know, let's face it, most pandemics are not existential risks. And you know, I mean, COVID obviously has been killing, you know, well under 1% of the population, so it's hardly going to finish us off. But you know, worse pandemics are conceivable, and you know, there are diseases out there that kill, you know, 50 or 90% of people infected. And if you're killing off 90% of a population, then the risk of just general societal collapse and conflict and being finished off by other processes, you know, is very, you know, much higher. So we were thinking, you know, what might be some of the ways to ensure that, you know, very severe pandemics don't impact, you know, in particular New Zealand, but island nations generally. And you know, the obvious intervention, and this was back in about 2017, is to close the border and try and keep it out before it even arrives. And so we did a couple of preliminary papers. It was very much just exploratory work looking at the cost effectiveness of this sort of strategy. And you know, looking back after COVID, it was probably a bit naive. You know, we sort of factored in the tourist economy, and we factored in, you know, the costs burden on the health system of if the pandemic did arrive, you know, as sort of the counterfactual, and you know, crunched a few numbers, and basically, unsurprisingly, there's a level at which the pandemic severity is such that it's actually cheaper to keep it out rather than, and suck up the losses.
Yeah, and we've witnessed that, with COVID itself, right? Because, even though the borders have been, shut for 2 years, we've actually gone quite well through all this. If you ignore sort of house price distortions and inflation, you can quite imagine that a Hermit Kingdom strategy would actually work very effectively, even for something that's just at 1%.
Yeah, and look, I think that's broadly right, but I guess I'd add a few things to that that are lessons perhaps for the future. One is that we went to the Ministry of Health actually in 2017 with this preliminary work and said, we've done a few back of the envelope type things. Do you want to fund some deeper research on this issue? And their response was basically, border closure will never be a policy option. Your work's interesting, but not practically relevant. So I think the lesson there is, that there's potentially groupthink floating around. There's historical bias, there's lack of imagination. These are some of the cognitive barriers to thinking about these things. And another learning, I think, is that we closed the border, but obviously we had the MIQ system and managed quarantine and so forth. And we had many incursions of COVID into New Zealand during that period, and some we were lucky to stamp out, and eventually we were unable to. And I think the lesson there is, well, if the pandemic was very much worse, killing 10% or 25% of people it infects, perhaps it's a mistake to actually allow anyone into the country for a period of time, just in case it comes in. Yeah.
Or any ship. Or any
ship. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And look, there's obviously major, ethical considerations around that, and probably should be, thought about a lot more deeply and have a public discussion around it. But when does the right of someone to return to their home country trump the potential deaths of 25% of the population and that sort of thing? So I think there's more lessons there, and some food for thought for the future.
And it would be a fascinating, really quite short piece of work really to build a model up, which is like, well, COVID's our baseline, right? And it was this infectious and this fatal, and then play with those two parameters. And right up to the 25%, 50%, engineered virus, say, and then what is the strategy? How do you not just keep say to boats that they're not allowed to come, but stop them from coming, because you're going to get refugees trying to make it here from all over the world, right?
Yeah, I look, that's basically the work that we suggested needs to be done. I completely agree with you. But another lesson that I guess came out of this is, so then we wrote a couple more papers thinking, well, what if it was really, really severe? Maybe it was 100%, fatal, and humanity was just basically going to die out unless some part of it was partitioned until the pandemic had passed. So the next couple of papers we wrote were looking at, well, where in the world are the most well-placed, populations for that to take place? And, unsurprisingly, we felt that they were islands, because obviously you've got a problem with porous land borders, if you're anywhere else. And these populations need to be somewhat self-sufficient to have that shutdown be effective. And we came up with an index that basically measured things like the location, the sort of population, and the resources that are available, and the social cohesion and so forth there. So we concluded that on that basis, it seems like Australia, New Zealand, and Iceland were the most well placed to sort of survive independently through this sort of period. A lot of other islands are heavily dependent on energy imports, or they're not food self-sufficient. Or they don't have a good public health system to try and stamp out any outbreaks that do happen to arrive, that sort of thing. But I think, again, we were probably a little bit naive with those. I think the theory is right, but it's actually harder to be self-sufficient than it appears, and that, I think, is because of this heavy dependence on trade for things like refined fuel and machinery components and expertise and so forth. So I think there's a lot more to be ironed out before we'd want to try and be completely self-sufficient.
So the question that came into my mind there is, in terms of the being naive, is the tacit assumption that the international rules-based order would just continue through this. And so, all of the countries where you do have a sort of like 75%, fatality pandemic raging through there are going to maintain their government integrity, and then that they're going to the rules around sort of national borders. I mean, we're seeing it happen in relative peacetime with Russia and Ukraine, right? And so I've read there's a fair bit of science fiction that goes into this. Neil Stephenson's Seven Eves, if you've read that, where the moon explodes and they realize there's sort of like only a few years now to get every human off the planet, or and then then there's sort of all of world government that pops up as a sort of autocratic dictatorship to create a lottery of who gets off the planet and who doesn't. And I wonder, what do you think that anybody's thinking about that extreme scenario when the nation state based rules based order that Aotearoa always supports just dissolves, just goes away?
I guess the first thing I'd say to that is almost the opposite point. That there are researchers out there who are trying to think, how could we feed everybody in a nuclear winter scenario, volcanic winter scenario? Is it possible to grow alternative food sources that don't depend on sunlight? So these might be things like seaweed that can grow in very low sunlight, or manufactured single cell proteins, these sorts of things. But my feeling is that the degree of coordination and trade in labor and parts and so forth, and transporting food to where it's needed and all these sorts of things is just so vast and complex that I really don't have faith that it would be possible in these sorts of scenarios, as you say, where global order breaks down and countries are hoarding food and physically unable to trade and so forth. So I think there's a lot of plausible scenarios where that whole system does really collapse, and once you get to that point, the risk of society, digital technological society falling apart everywhere, it starts to get higher and higher. And if the threat does pass and then civilization is to be rebuilt, it would be a lot easier for that to happen if there had been some sort of protected what you might call persisting nodes of complexity that had survived this, with institutions intact, with industrial society intact. And so that's a couple of papers working on at the moment kind of address this issue, where we're looking at the nuclear winter scenario or volcanic winter scenario, and how might somewhere like New Zealand or Australia or Iceland, what resilience measures might they invest in ahead of time that would help them be able to help kind of catalyze this reboot.
And I mean, I could just imagine, so when you're sort of having meetings in Wellington, discussing these eventualities, these scenarios, and this might be a good idea to invest in. I think one of your reports basically called for a commissioner, a future commissioner. Talk me through that, and then talk me through how those conversations go.
Yeah, so look, I guess we feel that there's quite a lot of interventions that you might do ahead of time that actually also have co-benefits, across other risks or across present day risks, or just for business as usual. And yet the process for assessing risks and deciding on interventions in New Zealand is, in my view, has a lot of shortcomings. And this is because there's a national risk assessment which assesses a range of risks, and then produces a national risk register where these risks are kind of listed adjacent to one another, according to their probability and their the magnitude of their impact and so forth. But firstly, it's not clear that process of assessment is linked to a process of capabilities enhancement or intervention or response in some way. partly because the whole thing is confidential, and so the average person can't access this information, and partly because it doesn't. If it's anything like the ones which do have a public-facing version, like the UK, there's a public-facing National Risk Register. They seem to leave out most of the risk. To be quite honest, there's no mention of nuclear winter or global food shortage or engineered pandemic and these sorts of things. And partly that might be a result of a national inward-looking focus of some of these processes, and which I think is a flaw in itself. And these national risk assessments probably need to be linked in some way globally. But also, there's certain features that a good assessment should take, and it probably should look over an appropriate time period. But a lot of these only look over maybe 2 or 5 years. It should be some sort of apolitical process, and at the moment it's sort of hosted in DPMC, which is officially sort of they're bureaucrats. It's an apolitical institution, but I think there's obviously some degree of yes minister.
And like you say, it's sort of driven by this 3-year electoral cycle, which has got a lot of positive things to say about it, but that ability to do long-term planning on a different cadence just isn't there.
So the Public Services Act 2020, I think it was, has now mandated these long-term insights briefings that each CEO has to produce in the public sector. But we'd like to see a more a sort of an independent, apolitical, aggregating, looking across ministries, agile, adaptive, kind of office, which we've proposed a Parliamentary Commissioner for extreme risks, like the Privacy Commissioner and the Children's Commissioner and so forth, and they would have responsibilities to, for example, future generations, and responsibilities to look across the long term in the interests of the country, and they'd be supported by a well-resourced office that could conduct these kinds of analyses and help coordinate across the public sector, and table their findings and recommendations and so forth to Parliament rather than to government, so that it's all more in the public domain. So something like that may well be a useful coordination mechanism. And I know the former Chief Science Advisor Peter Gluckman, he's proposed a similar idea, but he proposed that it would reside in the Office of the Auditor General, which I'm not sure that's quite the right place, because they're probably a bit hamstrung by by history and potentially groupthink, and there may be a need to change some minds in those sorts of areas, rather than create something fresh and built for purpose, rather than adapted for purpose, so to speak. What we've found, through some of our research, is that the national risk assessments of various countries, they have a process, and they produce often this 2-dimensional communication tool, the risk matrix, which has probability along one axis and consequences up the other.
Aliens arrive right down at the very
exactly. I stub my toe is extremely frequent, but of little impact. And so it's these risks that sort of cluster in that so-called upper right corner of those matrices that are supposed to be the ones that are salient and worth doing something about. But there's a whole suite of assumptions that are packed into that risk matrix. There's an assumption about the time frame of interest. There's an assumption about any discount rate on future impacts. There's an assumption on what kind of scenario is considered. Is it the worst case? Is it the most frequent case? Is it some plausible but challenging case? And so it's just a snapshot of one set of assumptions. And what we'd like to see is a two-way public dialogue where people can perhaps explore the risk assessment and change the parameters a bit. I'm interested in 50 years, not 2 years. I don't want to discount the future, future lives and so forth, and play around with it a bit. And that might help, experts and businesses and the general public sort of build a vocabulary around risk and engage with the government, and be able to give informed and considered feedback.
No, absolutely. It feels like there's a data surface there, some kind of model, an interactive model where you can Something I've been playing with on a couple of my analyses recently, where you can sort of plot scenarios against a number of axes, and so sort of asteroid landing, end of humanity is one scenario, but a small meteor landing on a large 20 million city or something is another scenario, and you could probably sort of navigate around that three-dimensional space and land on tangible scenarios to triangulate to. I think there's something you talked about earlier. You mentioned a couple of times is the interests of future generations, and so it's something that I've been thinking of, is how can you actually build a system in which the interests of people that aren't born yet, if something we do now affects them in 100 years' time, that there's probably more humans in the future than there are in the past, right? So how do you weight your decision-making democratically in 2022?
Yeah, look, I think that's one of the core problems, actually, because without future generations able to have a voice, then in many cases the decisions that get made now are pretty much biased towards the interests of those alive now. And so I think there's probably a sort of multi-pronged approach that you need to take to this. The offices like that proposed commissioner of extreme risk that I suggested, could have a legislative mandate, for example, to consider future generations. And I think that would be a reasonable thing to do, because I think when you talk to most people, and you have a reasoned conversation with them, not just sort of a slogan fight, most people agree that there's something important about future generations, even if it's just their grandchildren, and not any further in the future than that. But many people think that it really doesn't matter at what point in time someone exists. They have just the same rights and should be just as safe as everyone else. And so we could build that into legislation somehow. Perhaps potentially in like the Bill of Rights. Similar things could happen at the level of the UN. There could be international rights of future generations. But I think there's also movements around the world, like the Effective Altruism movement, for example, which take these sorts of questions quite seriously, and they're growing movements. And I think a lot of the times when people make decisions that are very much present bias, yes, there'll be sometimes self-interest there, but sometimes it's just simply a lack of reflection on the issue. And had they thought about future generations, which we're often not in the habit of thinking about in our day-to-day lives, then maybe decisions might have been made that were a little bit different. So effective altruism is basically a movement, I guess. It's also sort of a question, and the question is, how to do good well, how to do the most good with the resources available, and they often base their reasoning around this ITN framework, the importance, tractability, and neglectedness framework, which is sort of based in utilitarian reasoning, and derives its the pedigree of that goes back to the philosopher Peter Singer and his thinking. But basically, you think about how important some issue is, and packaged within that might be what effect is it going to have on future generations. If it's going to have a big effect, negative effect on future generations, then it might be more important than something that's going to have a small effect on present generations. And you think, is this issue tractable? Is there anything we can do about it? And if there is, then it's worth looking at. And is it neglected? For example, there's tens of thousands of people probably around the world looking at climate change and working on climate change, but there's only a handful looking at the aftermath of nuclear war, for example. And yet, if you multiply the probability and consequences of these two things, then maybe they come out roughly similar. So there's a bit of a mismatch of resources there. So thinking like that, a sort of rationalist approach, I guess, to risk minimization, might help. But effective altruism has also, like, traditionally it focused on issues like global poverty and animal welfare and global health. So things that are obviously big issues, and there's something tractable we can do, and they were often neglected and so forth. But it has drifted a bit into this long-termist sort of thinking, which is that, oh gosh, there's actually potentially trillions of future people. We might be at the very start of humanity's trajectory.
Well,
so,
we'll get into sort of transhumanism in a minute, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And so I guess they say, well, if there's a very small probability that something might, erase the potential of that future, then the expected value, probability times impact, could still be huge. And so this is where you start to get into some of the problems of this sort of thinking, and that, you may end up, rationality or may tell you to put all your resources into this thing that has a tiny probability of happening. So there needs to be probably some limits to this thinking, and another limitation is around what is called moral cluelessness, which is where we really don't know the long-term impacts of our actions. And the sort of, I guess the anecdote about the midwife who saves Adolf Hitler as a baby kind of thing, and and thinks they've done this amazing thing, but obviously the long-term consequences were very bad. And so it can be also very hard to know what to do given that sort of cluelessness about our actions. So I personally think you get much of the same mileage by focusing just on the risks in the near future. And
how do you define near?
Yeah, like let me put it another way. Even if all you look at is the next 1 year, and only people alive now, and you look at the worst case scenarios, well, then things like pandemics and nuclear war still look like they justify a lot of attention. And then I think you still get the same effect on the long-term future, but you've sort of thought about it a different way.
It's really fascinating, that idea of accounting for future generations. And I think one of the areas that fascinates me the most is this concept of human augmentation, and the fact that we're on this technological transhuman journey that's accelerating. And so, there's potential speciation events, going on around us where, I talk about sort of Homo Capitalus, which is sort of like humans augmented by capital, and they're all, they're superhuman. Sort of Elon Musk has more actuation capability, than any baseline human, because he's augmented with capital and hence technology. And if you think about evolutionary history, and you go back to the hominids running around on the African plains, then they would have had no conception whatsoever that we would be here having this conversation, on video conferencing, a few million years hence. And so for us to attempt to, sort of model the well-being of future generations when they will be different species entirely, hybrid, biological, technological, seems to be another factor anyway that makes it a much more uncertain model.
I think that's basically right. And I know, there's a lot of thinking around maybe this is one of the justifications for discounting the value of future lives, because we don't know what their needs are going to be, what their technologies are going to be, and so it may be unclear what to do now because we don't understand what the problem will be in the future. And potentially that underscores the importance of existential risks, because one thing we can probably be certain of is that they prefer to exist than not exist. And so if we can prevent humanity going extinct, that's at least one step in the right direction. That said, there's another class of existential risks, so which are known as S risks, basically which revolve around immense suffering. There's sort of situations where humanity gets locked into an unbreakable period of immense suffering, perhaps under some sort of totalitarian regime, and that may be worse than having gone extinct. So that's another one to add to the list, I think. Right.
Gosh, and so when you're working in this field every day, and sort of running these models of what's the worst that can happen, and how likely is it? So how do you apply this to your sort of day-to-day existence? If I could ask, so are you prepping right now? I mean, have you got sort of like a cabin in the woods with sort of 2 years worth of food?
So I guess so I'm not a prepper, so to speak, but beyond maybe preparations for things like the the AF8 earthquake, since I'm based in Reefton, basically right on the fault. So so I've got a month's food and those sorts of things, so that if the roads are cut off, like Kaikoura.
And I live here in Aotearoa, Christchurch, right? And so my the one lesson that event taught me was I was expecting societal collapse and looting and everything, and actually society just came together and everybody looked after each other as a community. It was really eye-opening how those times of stress and trouble actually do bring communities together to mutually assist each other.
I think that's absolutely right. And when we started looking at island refuges as a hub to sustain complexity and well-functioning society, we drew upon the literature around bunkers, from sort of goes back to the Cold War. There were nuclear bunkers and so forth, and there's been in the existential risk literature a lot of writing about things like submarine bunkers and Antarctic bunkers, the International Space Station, etc. But look, and these so-called billionaire bolt holes, allegedly down in Wanaka and whatnot. But if that's where the surviving humanity is going to be, and crawling out of those bunkers into a devastated world with limited expertise and a few pieces of technology that you've preserved in your bunker and whatnot, I think is going to be a much harder and possibly less rewarding situation than if we ahead of time plan for how to preserve whole communities where people can, as you say, all pitch in together and everyone has diverse skills and we preserve knowledge and all that. So I think island bunkers, for lack of a better word, island refuges, have a lot of merit over standard bunkers.
And in the absence of government taking that much of an interest, because it's not really going to be a vote winner, at the next election, are there independent organizations out there that are starting to group together and plan around these type of eventualities?
Yeah, so there are. Look, there's going back to the sort of effective altruism philosophy that I mentioned before. There's been a lot of philanthropic funding that has been poured into that area to fund projects exactly of the kind that that we're talking about here, whether it be thinking about bunkers or whether it be thinking about preventing an engineered pandemic or AI safety issues, or how to rebuild society after a collapse. And and the funding into that has grown and grown over the last few years. There's people like Sam Bankman-Fried with his new FTX Future Fund is funding this sort of research. Open Philanthropy does a lot of this work, and the Effective Altruism Long-Term Future Fund and so forth. So there's quite a lot of resource now coming into this, from the private sector, and actually mostly from individuals, to be honest. But it's still a drop in the ocean when you compare it to the likes of the UK's Overseas Development Assistance Fund, which is $20 billion or something else. And so if governments could take a different perspective, and they definitely have the resources to shift around to do more good than they currently do, on the basis of the sorts of calculations that I've just been talking about before.
One of the risks that we haven't really talked about, it, you did mention it earlier, is unaligned AI. And I think this is one that you and I have had a few conversations on in the past. What is your thinking, most up-to-date thinking on that problem, and maybe some of the tactics that, and I just say this in light of just recent developments that I've been following with autonomous drone swarms that are very close to being used in military contexts, if they're not already being used right now, and so how the killer robot scenario is pretty much upon us, and any efforts, I know that the New Zealand government has called for moratoria and is helping to stop the spread of these weapons, but they're so accessible on an open source basis to non-state actors and hostile actors, that I think that would be, swimming upstream against quite a strong current. So, what other, are you sanguine about it? Do you think there's a sort of evolution, Darwinian evolution that's happening there? So if a hostile AI evolves, then a benign AI will, co-evolve alongside it, and the two will sort of maintain equilibrium? Or do you feel that there's a much larger risk there of one outweighing the other?
Yeah, I think assuming that there'll be some sort of equilibrium, I think is the wrong way to go. I think that if you want to look at it through the lens of evolutionary dynamics, there's many examples in evolution where there's been that sort of arms race, but then some tipping point is reached and one eliminates the other, and that could certainly happen. And it may be that it's the humans that eliminate the AI, through the use of high altitude nuclear weapons and electromagnetic pulses or something. Maybe we have to resort to that one day. But look, I think it's clearly a growing concern. The AI threat generally, or autonomous weapons specifically. But I guess I see autonomous weapons and various other AI threats as more instances of these risks, as we were listing them before, and underlying all that, underlying our response across all those risks, whether it be pandemics or nuclear war or autonomous drone swarms, is this is the information that we have to hand and the beliefs that we have. And I think one of the main AI risks still, in my opinion, is the threat to of information pollution and misinformation and persuasion and so forth, particularly as we see the improvements in the technology with GPT-3 and
GPT-4 is out in a matter of months.
Exactly. And the some of the general purpose AIs that DeepMind is now is now tinkering with, and so and coupled with the dynamics that we see where social media is creating these siloed cliques of of extremist individuals and so forth.
With the parliamentary occupation protests, it was quite phenomenal just seeing how clearly captured those audiences became. And I saw some research coming out today that it was really only at 10 or 12 social media accounts that basically were propagated. They were the source of all of the key disinformation that drove it.
And so it's quite frankly, it's scary how quickly those because a lot of those beliefs and themes and so forth are relatively new. But I don't know how long the likes of QAnon has been around. It's it's probably 5 or 6 years or something of that nature, and then all the pandemic misinformation is obviously
Is it not just the latest instance of religion?
Well, it probably leverages many of the same psychological devices, and I guess the way I like to look at it is when I was studying cultural evolution as in human information transfer over generations and long periods of time, there were basically three drivers of what made information spread. These are the source of the information. If it's a more prestigious source, it's more likely to be taken up and believed. And I guess this relates to things like these hub Twitter accounts and stuff that that have so many followers and whatever, they're prestigious sources. It was to do with the frequency of the information, so the distribution of it in the population. If it's more distributed, people are more likely to believe it. It's a conformity effect. And then also the content of the information. Does it fit with what you already believe? Does it seem useful? Is it emotionally triggering or whatever? And so I think when it comes to the problem of misinformation and disinformation, we need to go back to some of these these broad theories and try and target the problem in a theoretical way. So if there's problematic prestigious accounts, that needs to be addressed in some way. If there's the illusion of frequency made by bots or whatever, then that can be addressed. And content, the AI systems are now pretty good at analyzing a text and telling you whether it's angry or emotive or whatever, and perhaps content that's particularly insightful, in tone and whatnot might be, I don't know what you do, is it automatically edited, or is it flagged as problematic? Or
but again, it's just an arms race, right? Because that comes back to the trust question in the first place. So is that a trusted source? So is that the AI that's telling me that this is misinformation, is that trusted in itself? And the whole thing just would just continue to evolve. Yeah.
And therein lies the threat, I think, of one of the threats of AI is that that cascade of doubt, I guess. It is. And I know that, speaking of science fiction, Neil Stephenson's got a great concept in his book, Fall or Dodge in Hell, where he talks of the flume, and social media just descends into such a cesspool of bots and misinformation and whatnot that you're a bold person who is willing to even step into it.
And everyone has their personal editor, who does that job for you. It's probably what I'm doing with Memia, actually.
I was about to say, Ben, I think you're my personal editor.
I do scroll through Twitter 5 hours a day, so you don't have to.
Exactly.
And I mean, one of the comments that you put on a post that's really stuck with me over time is how the logical outcome of this is going to be text generating bots in a Darwinian battle against each other to capture the attention of eyeballs and capture the attention of advertising algorithms. And so, the whole of the internet, the whole of the metaverse is going to become this sort of wall of stochastic white noise, AI generated content that's just continually trying to sort of clickbait us all in. And that, there's this concept of dark forests, the dark forest on the internet of where, you withdraw from being out there publicly, and then you create private networks. And I think we were talking about sort of like quantum entangled communications channels, from brain to brain. And maybe that's what comes out of this, is that you actually need completely private networks to exist alongside these sort of public fora, which are just going to become just loud.
Yeah, I think that's a serious risk. The internet and social media and digital communication, I mean, it's it's a block of information, and information over time tends to corrupt unless there's very active processes checking and editing, like maybe with, well, I was about to say like maybe with DNA, but even DNA over evolutionary time becomes very corrupted with virus DNA and ALU repeats and so forth. And I fear that at some point we may just have to cast the current system aside and look for some alternative.
Which I mean, you look at all the Web3 work that's going on right now. There's something in there. It's going to take a few more iterations to really get the value from that. I mean, just today I've been an alpha customer of a service called Skiff, which is completely end-to-end encrypted documents, collaborative documents, and so like Google Docs, but without a large Web2 company that can get in and look at the content. And they just launched an email service today, which has got the same protections. And then all of my storage is now on IPFS as well, so it's sort of resilient across a sort of decentralized network. So this technology stack, while we're seeing these sort of crypto booms and busts, cycles capturing the news, the technology stack of making far more decentralized and I guess the ability to keep your ideas private and maintain sort of private communications channels is certainly evolving beyond that. And that where I'm going with that, I mean, that's just basically a necessary part of the architecture is to have direct peer-to-peer communications without anyone listening in, right?
Yeah, look, this is possibly one area where I'm maybe not as optimistic as some of the Web3 proponents. I think there needs to be a new solution. Obviously, I don't think we can keep depending on the way we've always done things as the flume emerges. But I think there's problems with some of these distributed systems as well, which maybe we can iron out. As you say, maybe it just takes a bit more time. But I think we've already seen issues like various developmental entrenchments where decisions were made early on that perhaps were regretted later, but because of the either blockchain based or whatever nature of the system, it's very difficult to change. And then things have been changed, and then there's been outrage because the whole point was it was supposed to be distributed, but centralized.
But again, I just see those are bug discussions. Yeah. So and you're definitely seeing a pullback from code as law. And so if it's in the code, then it's law, and you're seeing this movement much more, back to more conventional human governance mechanisms, right, where the algorithm, isn't always right. And in some ways, I think cryptocurrencies are going. There will always be a base layer where if you really want to take the risk of holding your keys in your head and making your personal OPSEC around all that, yes, you could transact a Bitcoin to someone, I don't know, doing something nefarious over there, and if you with all that OPSEC, no one would know who'd moved the money around. But most people are going to want to act in a trusted layer where there's equivalent of like banking regulation, I'm guessing, and there's a social insurance that you're not going to be sort of wiped out because someone found your keys.
You've also made me think of one other risk issue, which probably I could have added earlier. If an island refuge like New Zealand, is cut off, we depend for a lot of critical data on cloud technology, obviously, which as I was having a discussion yesterday is basically almost entirely dependent on two companies, both from the same country here in New Zealand, and the data is still almost universally stored offshore. So, in a nuclear war or EMP or super volcanic eruption kind of situation, a lot of this could be destroyed, and banks and so forth could cease to function.
Someone loses the main ledger, right?
You can't get paid, you can't pay for anything, and these are obviously pretty catastrophic situations. And perhaps I do a fair amount of a sort of business continuity planning, as part of sort of overall strategic planning, and part of that is sort of like a nervous system, is that or a body when you hypothermic, is that it sort of withdraws blood to the core areas, right? And so a lot of business continuity strategies can be looked at like that, as well as that you need to withdraw to the core. It's very much your island refuge concept too. But no, the dependence, in some ways, we've got a food surplus, so it's going to be great. Nuclear winter comes, and there's probably going to be enough food for most of us. Plenty of milk powder for us to eat.
Plenty of milk powder. Yeah. Just don't go swimming in the rivers, right? But the flip side of that is that we have no indigenous hardware, manufacturing, digital technology manufacturing capability here. And so everything, and the whole world's basically dependent on Taiwan right now, which is, in Taiwan's, interests in many ways and not in others. There's a lot of manufacturing in China, and like you say, a lot of our, cloud infrastructure and software, goes through the west coast of the US technology giants.
There was a very interesting paper out last year about volcanic pinch points, and it drew attention to the fact that there's sort of these 7 regions of the world where there is potential for even medium-sized, let alone supervolcanic eruption, and they coincide with areas of dense and critical ports, airports, undersea cables, and so forth, and areas like Taiwan and the Luzon Strait and the Malay Peninsula and places like this. And New Zealand depends on, I think it's 4 undersea cables at the moment, the size of a finger. And so, look, I guess one of my challenges to I guess particularly decision makers, politicians who think that it's the next few years that are the most important, or or $10 tax cuts is what everyone wants, and this sort of thing, is to think, well, New Zealand and Australia and Iceland and some of these other places that I've mentioned are in quite privileged positions as the regions potentially most likely to be able to thrive through the very worst catastrophes. And maybe that puts some sort of obligation or responsibility upon those of us who live in these areas to try and maximize that potential, so that if the very worst does happen, then we do have our cloud data servers here. We do have agricultural self-sufficiency. We do have an electric or hydrogen vehicle fleet that doesn't depend on refined fuel imports, and for not just future New Zealanders, but potentially the future of humanity generally, that could be on a global scale one of the most cost-effective approaches to preserving humanity is to really bolster the resilience of a small island. Wow.
Well, I think that's probably a really good place to end the conversation, Matt. Thanks for that. Lots of food for thought. What are you working on right now?
So right now, we've just finished a draft of a paper about nuclear winter or abrupt sunlight reduction scenarios. So that's being peer reviewed by a few colleagues around the world. And then the next thing that I'm writing is somewhat of a conceptual analysis of the island's refuge and bunkers concept, because I think there's a few misconceptions floating around. People talk about these islands as a lifeboat, as if it's where everyone should run when catastrophe strikes. But obviously, if it's a serious pandemic, you don't want people running here because they bring the disease. So yeah, untangling a few of those thoughts is the next step for me.
Fantastic. And I know that you publish all your work online. So where can people just give us a link to ADAPT's website?
Yep. So adaptresearchwriting.com. And there's a blog on there and some ideas, a link to a tab about island refuges and some of our ideas for future research.
Fantastic. And on Twitter, you're at Matt_adapt.
That's correct.
Brilliant. All right. Well, look. So Matt Boyd, that's been a pleasure. Going all around that whole subject of catastrophic risk and existential challenges for humanity. I think we need to go and digest a lot of your ideas there. Thanks very much for joining me today on the Memia podcast.
Thanks, Ben, for the chat. It's been great.